So, welcome to my talk. This is my work during my PhD. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kassel. My talk is entitled as How Does Urbanization Affect Ecological and Social Dimensions of Agricultural Systems? It's a systematic review. So without further delay, I would like to introduce you first. Let's start with what urbanization is. It is an increase in share of urban population among the total population over time. It is also accompanied by the expansion of grain infrastructures or accumulation of capitals. So in the present context, at least around 55% of the global population live in urban area. And the share is expected to rise to at least 68 or around 70% by 2050. So what is the trend of urbanization? We can see urbanization is rapidly happening, mostly in the global south. In global north, it started quite some time ago and is slowly decreasing. But in global south, for example, in those big countries such as India, China, and Nigeria, it is really taking an acceleration. So what does it imply to agricultural system? Basically, what the previous or current literatures have shown is that agriculture, most of productive land are replaced by urbanization. It brings significant changes in land use and land cover, influences ecosystem services within agricultural system, which means also ultimately the food production. More directly, it influences regional farming systems. In this background, I would like to say that so current literatures are quite fragmented and individual. To scale up it, we aimed following three objectives through systematic review. What are the positive and negative ecological outcomes of urbanization in agricultural system? And what are those in social outcomes in those agricultural system? And how these outcomes are explained by continent, population size of cities, towns, and GDP per capita and dominant farming systems. To answer those questions, as I have been telling for some time now, we did a systematic review. We had outcome variables at ecological and social dimensions. At ecological, we have water quality, biodiversity, soil fertility, control of soil erosion, carbon sequestration, control of invasive species, and pollination. And at social dimension, we have income and employment, and then food security, equity, social networks, demographic stability, conflict mitigation, cultural identity, health, and education. Just to make them in unidirectional, meaning like all give a positive note, we had to make it like for example, control of soil erosion, not the soil erosion, and for example, conflict mitigation, not just conflict. As I already mentioned in the objectives, our explanatory variables are continents, population size, GDP per capita, and dominant farming systems. Here I have also shown what are those search engines we used for collecting literatures. We did literature scooping mainly in two search engines, Web of Science and Carb Direct. While using these strings, which are mainly, like first agriculture related, next urbanization related, and next the outcome variable related search engines, we found around 8,000 of literatures. After removing duplicates, we had around 7,000, and so on and so forth. We had like 107 literatures we included in the review. We had for this screening, we had 4 inclusion criteria. That the study must have been in urban landscape, should have at least one outcome or impact of urbanization in agriculture system, and the studies should be limited within 100. I mean, the study should have studied the outcome limited within the 100 kilometer of a city or a town, and the study shouldn't repeat result which is already published. That means should be empirical studies. So to present the results, as in the first result, we see the study was global, and mainly the outcomes are located in the global south, and mainly they are the socials. But the social outcomes are both. I mean, they are mixed. They are positive and negative. Relatively more positive than the negative, but can't really distinguish. So the ecological outcomes are mainly negative. Among those outcome variables, I would like to summarize what kind of pattern we see. Mainly the most negative outcome, ecological outcome variable was water, and most negative social outcome was demographic stability. However, surprisingly, most positive ecological outcome variable was pollination. I mean, I'm telling this most in terms of the share of the positive and the share of the negative, not like how many of them were in terms of number of the studies conducted. So among the most positive social outcomes was income and employment. Among the distribution of the outcomes across the continents, we found that social outcomes are mainly positively distributed in Africa, and the ecological outcomes mainly positively distributed in Europe. And ecological outcomes, which are more negative, are in South America, and also the social outcomes are in North America. I mean, also what I'm saying is that both are Americas. Okay, coming to the population size, here we can see ecological outcomes, and mega cities have mostly positive ecological outcomes, I mean, share-wise, and medium-large cities have mainly the more negative ecological outcomes. And the social outcomes, we have mainly medium-large up to mega cities have mainly positive social outcomes, whereas more than bigger than mega cities, or they have mainly negative social outcomes. So how about the wealth levels, GDP per capita? This is a national level. At the national GDP per capita is a national level here. So in terms of ecological outcomes, we see the poor countries have more negative ecological outcomes, whereas the richer countries or medium-rich countries have more positive ecological outcomes. And in terms of social outcomes, the larger income countries have more negative social outcomes, and the poorer countries have more positive social outcomes. And dominant farming systems, it shows clearly here in both ecological and social sides. Negatives are mainly in the animal-based farming system, for example, livestock or fishery, and mainly trees or perennial crop-based farming systems are mainly positive in both social and ecological sides. To come to the I've not seen the chat, but it was quickly popped up. I hope that wasn't arson. So in the discussion, we can see that mostly, as shown among the ecological variables, water quality is the most frequent and mostly negative outcomes. And it is also supported by Cadenasso et al. And his colleagues. where grey infrastructures basically seizes the water surface and decreases water infiltration. That means increases surface runoffs, which mainly carries the urban debris or industrial and agricultural waste and chemicals, and that might contaminate food and landscape chain, and also spread waterborne diseases, basically. And in terms of the soil fertility and control of soil erosion, it's mostly negative, and we see it is mainly because of having more concrete space or concretization, depletion of green spaces, and even, when the arable lands are replaced by the cultivated land, then more cultivation should be done where the slopes are more and so on. So this means erosion is more in those kind of land. However, urban setting also provides. Yes, please.
Sorry, Pramila, can you finish in about a minute, because I think you.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So I think we can discuss this discussion at least during the discussion, right? So I would like to skip this, and I would like to conclude that. Out of all these findings and backgrounds, I would and my team would propose that so to address those mainly negative ecological outcomes, perhaps the integrated approach of combining urban green infrastructures to farming system would address those negative ecological outcomes, and also address societal challenges, for example, food insecurity, and also preserve biocultural diversity in both global south and north. So their principles, for example, of integration, connectivity, multifunctionality, and social inclusion would foster the socio-ecological synergies in cities and also in its periphery. Thanks a lot. I look forward to discussing more. Sorry for the long talk.
Thank you, Pramila. Very interesting study. And there was also a question from the chat. From the chat, somebody was asking, what is the system boundary when you talk about agricultural systems? Do you talk about urban agriculture, or do you talk about rural commercial agriculture practices? Or do you look at both? Because I've seen you have a boundary of 100 kilometers or something, but what is kind of agriculture do you focus on in the review?
That's a good question, I think. I defined as mainly the 4 farming systems. That was in our 4 dominant farming systems. So, but actually we didn't per se define this farming system, but we basically define only 100 kilometers, as you have correctly pointed out, and we just see what are the positive and negative outcomes of urbanization within these 100 kilometers of the town or city in any of those farming communities. But then dominant farming communities were the one that we recorded for the analysis. We didn't limit to any farming system per se, but yeah.
Okay. Okay. So it's kind of a mixture of all occurring farming systems.
Yeah, but the dominant are recorded.
Okay, thank you. So, but as we don't have much time left, so I would not let time for other questions, but I would be happy to see the presentation of Stephanie Wunder now from the Ecologic Institute. Can you share the screen?
Yep, I'll do.
Great.
Can you see it?
Yeah. Can you change the mode to the...
Yeah, I'm just about to do that.
Okay, great.
There you go.
Yeah, great.
All right. Thanks, Markus. Oh, God. So do you want to negotiate me down from 7 minutes to 5 minutes, or what do we do? No? I'm open for every challenge. So unfortunately, I have not heard the first presentation, but I was lucky to listen to Pramila a bit, and probably the order is right, because I think, Pramila, you nicely dealt with the question of, like, you know, what are the positive and negative outcomes of urbanization and agriculture. We started at a different point, and it's not like pure research, but we did something for the German Federal Environment Agency and the German Federal Ministry for Environment. And it's actually the question of, like, okay, so we do have we do want to improve linkages between the urban and the rural, and what role does land use and play, and how to move towards sustainable land use. What role play food systems, and what can you actually do if you want to improve these linkages. So this project that I was just talking about is called Rural-Urban Nexus. It just ended last year. But we also have a current project going on, which is called COPOS, and is part of that big research effort of our Federal Ministry for Research that you have probably heard about in the last sessions. I won't go here in detail, but you have the slides, you can follow the links, and here we will have a look much more in detail on how cooperation structures can help to improve this urban-rural linkage. So I really try to have it really short because I'm interested in your concept afterwards. What I mainly would love to do or say or raise as a hypothesis that we try to answer is, if you want to improve these rural-urban linkages, you can and should go through regional food systems, and I'll explain that in a minute. But of course, there are plenty of benefits that you can see if once you go that route in other areas. And it's not just the benefits that you see in other areas, and Pramila also mentioned the social ones, for example, but it's also like if you want to start action in terms of like policies, then you also should prepare your arguments in a way that is accessible to different policymakers from health, from social background, from environmental, from economic, etc. So this is what I'm going to talk about, like how can you move that train forward, talking with policymakers about sustainable rural-urban linkages. And that's probably something that the prior speakers have mentioned before. We do see that here in Germany. I actually haven't introduced myself. I work at the Ecologic Institute. We're based in Berlin and do applied environmental research and policy consultancy. So we do see that here in Germany, but we see that everywhere in the world that where this question pops up of rural-urban linkages, be it in the health area or land use or just actually social policies within cities. So there's a lot to take advantage of. And the benefits that I mentioned earlier and the routes you should go to, actually work with different actors are very different ones. And I just name I think it's 8. So we have seen fantastic examples of, agriculture within cities. Pramila just talked about it. That actually started from an environmental protection background, like Edible Andernach, a small city in Germany, where they try to introduce like old and rare tomato species and other edible species in the city. So cool, thing for the environment, but obviously with a lot of other positive background things. We've seen other cities such as Ghent in Belgium that actually try to increase the healthy school food, mainly vegetarian food, and have been very, very successful in developing actually urban food policies there and achieving multiple benefits. The issue of food security and food sovereignty is something that is not as pressing here in European circumstances, but if you talk about food deserts in the US and elsewhere, that's of course important as well to speak about like regional food systems to achieve some benefits there. Of course, something that is always working is regional identity, regional value chains, keep the economic value in the region. That is a good reason to push food systems in a rural-urban linkage. But of course, resilience is a big issue as well. I mean, the pictures I included here that were, is an example of, heavy rainfalls, and the urban spaces that are green that, offer food production, of course, do play a role here as well. Are, nature-based solution, very cheap, but also in terms of resilience that we see in the corona pandemic, it is worthwhile to mention. Then actually the whole issue of integration in neighborhoods is important. So coming back to Pramila's social background, and what you see is actually that the first urban gardens, at least here in Germany, have actually started as actually intercultural gardens. So to integrate people from other countries that are used to, we're used to gardening, and we're looking for these opportunities. So that was very strong. And last but not least, the whole question of like, how do we involve civil society in urban planning, in urban regional planning? Food is a fantastic entry point because everybody eats, everybody has something to say here. So you can deal with that very well in setting up regional food systems. So my almost last slide is about actually, I think, the most important point, because like if you're convinced like, okay, you should do that better, you can improve rural urban linkages through regional food systems. So what do you do? And what do you do first is to establish a regional food strategy. I could talk about that later, but it won't go here in detail. A crucial issue is you need to work on the access of land to land. So even in Germany, we have issues like, land grabbing. So that's very important. The rebuilding of regional value chain with all the infrastructure included is something that we actually need to rebuild here, at least in Europe, in Germany. Public food procurement is a very powerful tool to actually make things happen. So the way that hospitals, schools, kindergartens, etc., are buying their food from regional areas. And what we also heard in the last presentation is the question of multifunctional use of land, not just urban land, but also the rural one. So to combine production, recreation, nature protection, this is possible, but hardly explored so far. And last but not least, to come back to research questions, it is actually important to improve the database because you hardly have any database that show you the interaction between urban and rural areas because you have different administration units, and that's pretty much the same everywhere in the world. So that's a big thing for researchers to do. Happy to discuss further. That's about it. And I stop sharing my screen in a second.
Thank you very much, Isabella or Nina. Is there some questions from the chat?
I'm checking.
Because I cannot see anything at the moment.
No, there's no question. Because also the presentation is still a bit delayed.
Okay. Then we can, still we wait for the questions. First, I will give a reminder. Everybody who haven't done the poll yet can still do the poll next to the wall of ideas, so please do so. And does anybody from you now here in the smaller group has a question to Stephanie?
Yeah, of course. So you just said establish a regional food strategy. So this is kind of a big thing. So what is your approach to that?
Oh yeah, I had another slide, in case this question comes up, I would have shown it. No, of course, that's probably like too big for that quick question. But we actually established like eight steps what you should actually do. So I would really recommend a bit of reading there, or we could chat even afterwards, because that's indeed a really difficult questions. And RUAF and the FAO actually did a very good, big project, 3 years long. I think it was 9 cities all across the globe. That was a good starting point, but of course, like also what we have learned in Europe. So that's maybe in a nutshell, that's what we learned from the international level, but also what we could learn in Europe. Or should I try to go in detail, Markus?
No, you can explain it shortly.
I can explain shortly. Should I read out the 8 steps?
No, okay, but no, it's fine. I think. Thank you. But because we are really bad on time, I will now try to show our framework that we wanted to discuss for about 45 minutes with all of you. But I mean, I will just present it for 10 minutes, and then we have a look at it and talk about it at least for 10 minutes, let's say. So I will start sharing my screen. This one. Okay, you should see it now in full screen, right?
Perfect.
Yeah, great. So yeah, this presentation was supposed to be an hour ago, roughly. No, but 40 minutes. The four of us, we developed a framework for the interface of food system, urban-rural linkages, and land use change. And to do so, we did a systematic review, a bit like Pramila, but at a smaller, or let's say in a smaller region. We focused on Europe because we thought, okay, it's a European conference, we take a European focus, although we sometimes also work outside Europe. And then we did a cluster analysis of the reviewed studies, and we developed the first draft of a framework that you might already see in the wall of ideas. So during my talk, you might also already have a look there at the wall of ideas. There is a framework, and you can click on a link where we can change later on some items, some linkages, some issues we might have missed. But the aim of developing the framework was not just to have the 10,000 frameworks, but also to show a bit what is the current research at this interface of food systems, land use, land cover change, and urban-rural linkages, and what should be done to be a bit more holistic and to consider major links. For the reviewed studies, we came up with 3 major groups of studies, what the 3 different colors show here. And we have 2 major axes from the left, on the x-axis from rural to urban, and on the y-axis from consumption to production, if you think about a value chain, production, processing, and so on. The first group of studies, these turquoise, light blue one, are these classical footprint LCA studies that take more kind of a value chain perspective. They go along the value chain, but they think about more from the urban side. So you kind of go from the consumer and see what is the footprint of the consumer. You have this kind of studies. On the other hand, the second group that we identified is a green one. These are classical land use change studies that comes from the rural side, from the production side, and more or less go more towards production. What happens if we have agricultural land use change with food provision, and it's more this, let's say, rural perspective, and going less up the value chain. And many of these studies do not manage to get till the consumer in the end. And then we have a third group of studies that are not so quantitative. That's why the yellow arrow is a bit dotted. They are more qualitative, and those are these kind of policy studies that look at, for example, this food policy Stephanie talked about before, and all these implementation kind of things that are not so much the quantitative assessment, but more an analysis of the spatial governance or the agricultural policy, mostly in an urban context. But some more results. I will try to keep it short. Here on this slide, you see the 4 clusters and the overall analysis. And yellow means the study did not include a method, or red means the study included a method. And here on the left, you see all the different methods. And this first cluster I've already explained are these land use, land cover change studies, because you see the red bar is on land use modeling mostly. And then we have the second cluster that is more on crops. Here, this is crops. And also LCA and footprints here. You might also see it here at the bottom. And the third one are these qualitative policy analysis. And also looking at documents. For the urban-rural linkages, we found that most studies work across all different types of, let's say, population density. As all of the studies look at cities, towns, and suburbs and rural areas. Only in cluster 3, they focus mostly purely on cities. It's what you see here at the bottom is a U classification from rural to urban areas that we used and how we grouped our study areas. Now we looked at land use, land cover change. We looked at the studies whether they consider the negative impact on agriculture or build up qualitatively and quantitatively, or positively, quantitatively and qualitatively. And just, the first group of study hardly did any land use change analysis. It's this group of studies that are footprint studies that just look what is the impact, but do not quantify the impact on land use change. And the second are these classical land use change studies that have been extensively done from my point of view. They look at the decline of agricultural land, and they also quite often show the increase of built-up land, also quantitatively. This pattern is quite pronounced in all of these studies. Nothing really surprising there. For the environmental impacts, there was something interesting. For the land use studies, here, cluster 2, we had negative quantitative impacts on environmental quality and landscape diversity as it was quantified in the studies. For the other group, the footprint studies, they had both positive and negative quantitative impacts, so not so directional. That was quite interesting. Yeah. If we think about, we have these land use change studies, they take the perspective of land use change, and due to land use change, we have a change in the food system, a bit like Früh-Müller's study on urbanization. And these links are mostly quantitative, what we see here. And then the policy studies that we talked about before, they also take the land use to food system perspective, but they mostly talk about it qualitatively. So then we have the other perspective from the food system to land use change. In the food system perspective, in these footprint LTA crop-based studies, yes, it's there. But in the other studies, in the land use change studies, it's hardly there here on the left side. Yeah, and I think I will jump now over drivers of land use land cover change due to time, but for the land use change studies, it's always a pattern, demand for housing, land consolidation, which is quite pronounced. And the other one for these footprint studies, it's agricultural management and global competition. That's the driver. And for the policy, it's qualitative drivers. These drivers I will jump over. And now we come to a framework. And for this framework, I think Andrea will show the screen because we developed the framework in Miro, and we would like to discuss it with you now a bit in the remaining minutes. You can write in the chat if you then later on, when we show you and discuss the framework, disagree or agree with items. Normally you could have talked a bit more, but as the system crashed, we cannot let you talk very easily.
I would like to hint on a question from the chat. So Professor Kim Philip Schumacher is asking, I'm not sure if this is not maybe a question to Stephanie. Any ideas on how to convince farmers who are producing for global markets integrated into global systems to switch to a production for regional customers? Oh, Stephanie, I think your micro is on mute.
Yeah, it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, I suppose this question actually indeed went to me because it came a couple of minutes later than my presentation finished. So happy to take that up. Absolutely, very, very good question. And that's something we see here in Germany that, even around Berlin, farmers are producing for the global market. So the way to convince them is, you need to go through planning security. So public procurement is the most important tool. But also many of them see the downsides of the global markets and are actually looking for higher priced regional markets. So this is where the regional food strategies come in, so that you really have a mid and long-term strategy how to rebuild these regional food systems, including all the infrastructure and processing you need.
I have a quick question to follow up. When I see in retail chain that most of the regional products are expensive than the important ones, I wonder then how general public could afford that and how could that be sustainable?
Is that going to me or is that going to Markus with the framework?
First, maybe to you, and we can discuss later on with the framework.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that. Yeah, there is one thing with cheap food. Our cheap food is too expensive because actually the costs of that kind of cheap food production sit elsewhere in the society in terms of health costs, in terms of cleaning water, in terms of regenerating soil and all of that, not talk about like animal welfare and worker conditions. Once we have established a level playing field again, this kind of production is not more expensive anymore. And this is why policy is such an important thing to come in, and not to trust, that, some consumers will make the better choice, because then we're not talking about food system change that we need, but like increasing little niches in the market that actually work against the market power.
I would like to add something to that. There was recently an interesting approach by a supermarket in Berlin. I think it was Penny or something, who really was showing the total environmental costs for products. That was really, I think, an interesting approach for really highly commercial markets that hardly normally deals with sustainability. And that was quite an interesting approach, but I think they stopped it, or?
I haven't heard that they stopped it. I just heard everybody talking about it. I mean, actually, they were simply putting another price tag on it. They were not paying their farmers better. So fantastic advertisement campaign. Really, congratulations. But I mean, of course, at least the supermarket did that. So great. There are external costs. There is a second price tag.
I want to add here a comment from the chat. Amelie Michalke is thanking you, Stephanie, for addressing that, and they are looking at the external cost of food, in fact, in their poster session too. So if someone is interested to check their poster out. And Markus, there is another question in the chat for you.
Yeah, I've read it. Nina posted it to the chat. It's a question about when it comes to food. These urban clusters have mostly qualitative studies. But the driver for the qualitative urban is also qualitative. Yes, it's true. I mean, they explain what I mean with drivers in these qualitative studies. It's a mostly analysis of, for example, changes in urban food production, or it is about allotment gardens in cities and the description of the development of, for example, of these allotment gardens. And then they qualitatively in these studies explain why these allotment gardens developed, or why there were changes in the land use or the planning structure. These kind of questions. So they did a quantitative analysis of drivers or statistical analysis. Good, I think, but it would be good now, I think, if we move to the framework. Andrea's already showing it.
Okay, yeah. So you can see it already, yeah? Then I would like to introduce you to the framework we were working on in the last days. As Markus said, we looked at several studies, and from this background, we developed this framework that somehow tries to connect the food system with the land system, and also looks at the rural-urban space in total. And I will try to summarize it now for you in a quick way. It's now here developed in the whiteboard of Miro, and we wanted originally to discuss it with you in the group, but unfortunately you can now only give feedback via the chat function, so please use the opportunity. And I would like now to start here with the food production, because this is basically the first step for us. It doesn't matter where the food is produced, either on an agricultural field or at an allotment garden at the city. It is always, of course, bound to certain environmental conditions, so the climate, but also certain social or economic characteristics from the farm or the farmer. And then the food, dependent on the quality and the quantity of the products, goes somehow to the food processing unit and to the food distribution, and is of course also dependent on the globalized competition. And further on, at a certain point, of course, the consumption takes place. And here it is, food consumption is, of course, influenced by certain trends, the consumption patterns, or also willingness to pay, or socioeconomic indicators such as population change. And then strongly interconnected is the food system now with the land system. And the agricultural land is in conflict to other land uses, such as built-up land or forest land, or also demands for ecosystem services such as regeneration issues. And here comes then, of course, the very important policy and governance structure into play. And this, of course, has then influence on the various drivers of the food and the land system. And of course, everything here is somehow also connected to the space, the rural and the urban space that Markus also tried to show at the very beginning of the presentation of him, that dependent on the study, we looked at the perspective of the rural or the urban space differed quite a lot. So this is now our first draft of a possible framework, and we would like to discuss now with you about this framework, and would be happy to have some feedback.
Since so many people cannot speak, I have the pleasure to have an open mic. I could say it's something that I've also written in the chat. It's always helpful to think about concepts. What I was noticing immediately, and wonder if it's simply been forgotten or if you don't think it's a priority issue, is what's actually happening with nutrients, with disposal of food, with manure, with compost, whatever. Where is it?
Yeah, good point.
This is, if we think circular, then you immediately realize at least you didn't have a value chain, but the circularity is, and this is essential between food and
you're totally right. Our view is a bit biased by our studies, and we integrated now, especially those factors that were quite pronounced in the studies. So. Let's put it this way.
Question is that the nutrient addressing the nutrient from the food, or the nutrient to the food, and for example, input to the food production?
No, I'm talking about like something like nitrogen and phosphorus. So the essential key components you need for agriculture, that is,
as input. Input.
But of course, like you can add different dimensions of nutrients, but I'm more talking about like disposal and reuse of resources, or recycling or whatever. Right. And thanks, Matthew, actually, for the question in the chat about public procurement, that it won't happen just like that. Living in Berlin, we at least slightly more political, progressive approach to do that, but I'm absolutely aware that this is not taking place without pressure of civil society, and that there are other markets as well. True.
No, it's a good point to take all the, let's say, the waste side of it. But the interesting thing is, it was not very prominent, at least not in the keyword search about food systems that we did, and all those things hardly popped up in the studies. But it would be a good point if we move to putting it an idealized framework to add this component. I think it's really good. There was another question by...
excuse me, sorry to interrupt. We just have... the reminder that we should now switch to the next session.
We have 5 more minutes, I guess.
We have 5 more minutes, I read in the chat. So we will use the 5 minutes. No, but there was one question by Kim Schumacher, and he said, what about food processing? Yeah, actually, we also were looking for studies that were doing it, but with this, if you look for food system and so on, food processing is quite often overlooked. We added it here on purpose. And if you move, Andrea, could you move to the right a bit more? To one, it doesn't matter, to one of the other frameworks, because in the other we then mapped the different studies, and you see the green arrows means an issue is considered, but you see a lot between food processing and distribution and consumption. There was hardly any study, at least in our set, that was covering it, but only other parts of the value chain. There was another question.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the governance also includes the institutions, for example, cooperatives and so on. It does?
It does. It doesn't name it in
but
detail,
we had it in the,
we have it in mind, but I can just write it.
Yeah,
and
yeah, you're right.
There was a question by Jose. Actually, yes, the energy, we also considered the demand for energy as the same as demand for urbanization, but it was not that often occurring. That's why we did not put it here in the framework, but we have it in our keyword search and also in the categories. Byproducts, yeah, byproducts is good, although it's a bit euphemistic instead of waste. But
not necessarily.
Yeah, now it can be. It depends a bit. What if you find a good? Yeah, if you can set it into value.
Maybe somewhere here.
So, is there something more in the chat? Yeah, great. Yeah, normally.
One thing. How about the capacity buildings, for example, skills and so on? Do we have to? Do you think they're important to?
Yeah, good point.
We can. Oh, it's good. Would be good to list them. I mean, it was supposed to be a European framework. It's a bit different than if you put a framework like your global framework. But still, capacity building is important. Probably a bit different, but yeah.
I was reflecting my work earlier before joining PSDN.
Yeah. Nina, you can also talk. You don't have to write. Nina?
I didn't want to interrupt you
Okay.
while you were talking. I think I posted all the comments that we got in the MEA chat also here now. I think we covered most of them. And if I remember well, the preparation meeting we had before the workshop started, we need to wrap this up now already. Since it's already past 3.
One last question: how can we, or will you share it, this framework, later on, or how can we access it after you publish it? Or
link as the chat, but also you can find it at the Wall of Ideas of session 19. There's a link, you can follow it, and then you can also add any questions, ideas into the framework. We are happy for any comments.
Perfect. That sounds great.
Yeah, but we can also send you the editable version, or because I think now the Wall of Ideas is the shared version where you can just, but you can write if you're interested to edit, then just let me know and I will send you the editable version, and then we can see how we proceed with it.
Very much looking forward to that. Thanks.
Good. So thank you very much for joining this session. Unfortunately, it was very, a bit mixed because of the technical issues, but at least we had all elements. We would have looked, or we were looking forward to have a longer discussion on our framework in the end, and also to link it a bit more to the previous presentation, because I really enjoyed the 3 presentations from really a very nice systematic literature review that I've seen by Pramila on really, agriculture, urbanization worldwide, which is was really interesting for me. But then the more applied studies and more policy-oriented approaches by Stephanie Wunder, and the first part by Jose, unfortunately, I haven't seen it because I had technical issues. But still, it was very interesting, and it could have been a bit longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also, thank you to our presenters for being so
Patient.
They are kind
Patient, yeah.
with us on our technical issues.
I think we just have to adapt with this new normal.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
an
that's it.
improv theater session, right? See it that way.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Science slam. Good.
Yeah,
Thanks a
kind
lot.
of. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Danke, tschüss, bye.